What's up, everybody? This is Mr. Herzl again. I'm the Social Studies Coordinator for Life Schools, and whether you're here for a review, if you've come here for that, or if it's the first time that you have learned this information, I'm going to help you understand it. So today we're going to talk about the Articles of Confederation and the Northwest Ordinance. Of course, every week we see this screen, and it's the TEEX that the state of Texas wants you to know, and this means that, for the STAR test, these are the things that almost are guaranteed to be on there, or that they might ask you questions about. So sometimes it's guaranteed, sometimes they might ask you, but it's just important for you guys as students to understand that these are the things that the state of Texas wants you to know. So they want you to be able to summarize the strengths and the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and they want you to be able to explain how the Northwest Ordinance established principles and procedures for orderly expansion of the United States. Both of those are going to be clearly explained here during this video. All right, so when America declared independence in 1776, they needed a new form of government. And so they wanted a republic where citizens voted for elected leaders to represent them. You have to understand that we take for granted that the system of government that we have just kind of always has been. But back then, they were kind of making it up as they went. They didn't know what they were going to have. They didn't have any set way to move forward. They just kind of knew from former empires and governments what they liked and what they didn't like, and so they had to come up with a plan. And so they decided that from those examples from the past, they really liked a republican form of government, a republic, and so that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to protect citizens and individual states from powerful national government. You have to remember, they're coming off of the war, King George III. The entire reason why they revolted in the first place. And so these people are going to be very, very careful that they don't give the federal government more power than it should have. And so if you're kind of like thinking about who should have more power, the states or the federal government, they're going to err on the side of the states, or they're going to side with the states. Even if the federal government, by not giving them enough power, isn't going to be able to do anything, the people coming out of the Revolutionary War don't care. They want to protect the citizens and make sure that, hey, we never have this kind of tyranny again from a federal government. And so they're going to make a government that's very weak, a central government that's very weak, that gives most of its power back to the states. The American Republic would be a more enlightened version of the Roman Senate. Now, you guys haven't had world history yet, but when you do in 9th grade, you'll learn about Rome. And so Rome gave us kind of a structure for the republic that we have today. And a more enlightened version of that would mean that more people in America would have a say in the government. They would be able to vote. More people would be able to vote. And the central government would have a bigger legislative body than the Romans did, and it wouldn't be based on property ownership or status in society. As far as that goes. And so, you don't need to know all those things about Rome, but just understand that our system is based on the Roman system. When independence was declared, the 13 colonies became independent states. Okay? So before they were colonies under English rule. Now they're going to be independent states, almost like independent nations, but not quite. I would say it's at this point in time, it's almost easy to think of them as different nations under one alliance, meaning that they're all kind of different nations, but they're all brought together under one alliance. Much like the European Union is today, all different countries in Europe, all brought under the same alliance with the European Union. But we did call ourselves a country, and we were the United States of America as a country, so it's a little bit different. The states had more, really the way to think of it is the states had more power, federal government had very little, but they were all brought together under one country. Okay, each state had its own constitution, its own legislative body that made rules, and they each had their own governor and 8 states at that time had Bill of Rights. But the U.S. Needed a national government to do things that states couldn't do. They needed to be able to sign treaties, international treaties. They needed a way to protect all of the states under one. So there's a lot of things that we'll get into it and we'll talk about it here a little bit later, but there's a lot of things that independently the states couldn't do because they're really small. But together, if you put all of their power together, they would be much more successful in doing. Okay, America's first national government was the Articles of Confederation. Many times people think that the Constitution was the first government. It actually wasn't. Constitution is made because the Articles of Confederation were kind of failing at the time when the Constitution was drafted. And so it's really important for you to understand. We talk about the Constitution all the time because that's the government that we live under right now today. But for a few years before the Constitution was drafted, for roughly 10 years before that, we have the Articles of Confederation. That's the first form of government our country had. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so each state under the Articles of Confederation could send between 2 to 7 representatives to the National Congress, but each state only had 1 vote. To pass a law, 9 of the 13 states had to agree. The National Congress could make laws, settle disputes between states, negotiate treaties, handle Indian affairs, and oversee a military. The only problem is to get any of that done, they had to have the agreement of all the states. And to get any of that done that costs money, like having a military, they needed money from the states. So they could ask for money from the states, but they couldn't force any of the states to give them money to do any of these things. And so even to pay for someone to even be in the federal government, if you had a secretary to one of these representatives, let's say, and that representative, he or she needs to get paid, and so you couldn't even pay that individual because without getting money from the states, and the states didn't always give money, and so there was no way to make the states pay for a federal government, and so there's lots of problems. But one of the other things to think about is that each state only had 1 vote. So that means that bigger states and smaller states had the same vote. And, a large state with a huge population like Massachusetts or New York, that's not going to make them very happy when a state like Rhode Island gets the same exact vote. And Rhode Island has just a very small population. So how is that fair? Hey, if you're New York and you're saying we have this massive amount of people in our state, but we get the same vote as this state that only has tens of thousands of people in their state. That's not fair. And so, when we do get to the point where we're going to look at the Constitution and look at changing it, small or large states are going to be in favor of that. So I'm starting to talk about the problems with it, because that's usually what we talk about with the Articles of Confederation. But let's just keep moving on. Okay, again, all of the powers are left up to the state. The state has all of the power. Okay, so if the federal government wants to do anything, it has to get the state's approval and it has to get the state's money to be able to do it. Okay, Americans didn't want to recreate a powerful government like the one they just fought the Revolutionary War to break away from, which we already talked about. So the national government had no president and they couldn't raise taxes on states or citizens. Again, the federal government, meaning what we think now of Washington, D.C., when we think of our president, that's a federal government. They're the ones that are federal government is what joins all the states together and makes us a country. And for them to do anything, they needed money from the states. The states had to give it to them. They couldn't force the states to do it. Also, you don't have a president because they were scared that the president would become a king. And so you don't have a president, you don't have any leading person that is the face of the nation like we do today. Right, from the records of the Federal Covenant in 1787. Let our government be like that of the solar system. Let the general government be like the sun and the states the planets, repelled yet attracted, and the whole moving regularly and harmoniously in their several orbits. So, these people talk about a government where you have everything working together, but that wasn't necessarily the reality on the ground. Okay, Western land claims in 1783. Land claims between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River that were acquired from the British in 1783 were claimed by numerous states. So here's what you have. I'm going to make my pointer a laser pointer. Here you go. Okay, so these states or these areas over here, you have these states: North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York. So all of these states that have just become states that were colonies are here. And when the British had taken claim to this after the French and Indian War, they had laid claim to it and said, hey, this is British area. But certain colonies and states had then laid claim to those areas. So as you can see here, like North Carolina is a great example. They said, okay, well, then we're claiming everything from our border all the way to the Mississippi River. That's our land claim. And so all these states had made claims out west, and they said, that's our land. So in other words, like if we would have just let them do whatever they wanted and let them continue on with their claims, North Carolina would go all the way to the Mississippi River, which we know obviously now that's not the way that it works, or that's not what actually happened. And so what did happen was that these states had these claims and they didn't know how they should solve this problem. So how should what the they decided to solve the problem was the articles basically that the states had. So the Articles of Confederation are going to fix that land. All right, so states had to give up their land in western areas. So basically the states, it wasn't their land anymore, it was the federal government's. And they ceded that land to the federal government. So everyone gave up their land claims. They said, listen, that land isn't mine, it isn't yours. And one of the reasons they did that is because if those states kept those land claims, there's a good chance that states would get into wars between each other and fight each other based on the land claim. Instead, they just said, hey, it's all ours, it's all the federal government's, and they can decide what to do with it. And there's actually a system in place that the Articles of Confederation put in place for creating new states. All right, so Congress is going to pass the Land Ordinance of 1785, and that is going to create an orderly way to survey and organize the land into townships. So that Land Ordinance of 1785 is going to sell less western lands, and that was really the only way that the national government could generate money. Remember, national government can't go to Pennsylvania and say, you have to give us money, we're taxing you, give us money to pay for a military. Or they can't go to North Carolina and say, hey, you owe us war debt from the Revolutionary War that the federal government, that we took on as a country. Give us money. They couldn't do that. So the only way that they could get money, they could get money to even function was to take this land that had been ceded. Ceded means given, and it had been basically given from these colonies, and it had been given to the federal government, and to sell that land. It's the only way they could make any money. All right, so the Land Ordinance of 1785 is going to basically create how to become a state, how to set up townships, how to create a town in those areas, how to split those towns up and sell off the land within those towns and within those areas. And so that's important. Also here, it says down here, the national government was placing an emphasis on public education. And as you can see, there's even room for public schools reserved for, public school. They would break off all of this land 6 miles by 6 miles, and they would sell off plots, but they would reserve certain areas and certain spaces for things like public education. All right, so the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 gave the government to the territories. All All right, so these territories were basically just big areas of land, and the territories had to become states in some way, shape, or form. And so the Northwest Ordinance is really, really famous for setting up a way that a territory could go from being a territory to becoming a state. It's written by, of course, what everything's written by, Thomas Jefferson. And it famously gives these outlines of how everything could become, or how a territory could become a state. So when a territory had 5,000 residents, it could create a self-governing legislature. So they could set up their own legislature when they had only 5,000 residents, and that's really not that many. And then when a territory had 60,000 residents, it could apply to become a U.S. state. And also, what's really famous about the Northwest Ordinance and what's going to have a huge impact on what we're going to talk about later in this course is that the Northwest Ordinance outlawed slavery in that Northwest area. Okay, so when we're talking about the Northwest area, we're talking about the Great Lakes area in the states that are there. You're talking about Michigan, Ohio, those kind of states there around the Great Lakes. And so that's really when if you see a question on the STAR test about the Northwest Ordinance, just understand that what it's famous for is setting up a way for a territory, just a kind of an area of land, to become a state. All right, and so it sets out very clear guidelines about how that could happen. One other thing about the Northwest Territory, when we're talking about the Northwest, you know, when people say the Northwest portion of the United States, they're usually talking about Oregon, Washington, Idaho. That's not what we're talking about here. Northwest, if you're one of those colonies who's just become a state, you're Virginia. Think about what's northwest to you if you live in Virginia. It would be this area we're looking at here, right here on this map. So the Articles of Confederation were America's first form of government, and we need to talk about the weaknesses of the national government under the Articles of Confederation. Again, that's what we're going to talk about. That's what most people are going to talk about when they talk about the Articles of Confederation, because ultimately the Articles of Confederation fail and we need a new government, and we get the Constitution because of that. So the weakness of the national government under the Articles of Confederation was originally seen as a good thing. Again, you're never going to have a King George III. You're never going to have this kind of tyranny that they're so worried about. But it also, it severely limited the federal government from doing anything. Okay? Later, those same weaknesses kept the government from solving serious national problems. So what are the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? Okay, number one, inability of the government to collect taxes. That's going to lead to problems. Again, if they want any money, they have to sell land for it. Or they have to ask a state for that money. And most of those states are going to be like, no way, we're not giving our money to you. Here's some weaknesses here. And then their outcomes. Congress had no power to lay or collect taxes. What's the outcome? The government was always short of money. Weakness. Congress had no power to regulate interstate or foreign trade, meaning that they had no ability to regulate trade. So one state could have a tax on, a tariff on goods coming into their area, and another state could have something else. And then you have interstate commerce as well between two different states. So a state could be, trying to trade with another state, and they're making all kinds of back deals and everything, and then that hurts another state. And so it creates all these problems where the federal government, they didn't have the power to come in and kind of settle those issues and regulate those issues, make laws about those issues. The next one, Congress had no power to enforce its laws, so the government depended on the states to enforce the laws. So the government could make laws, right? We talked about that, under the Articles of Confederation, we had a legislature. We sent people to go and be a part of that legislature, but unfortunately they could make laws, but nobody could even enforce them. I mean, there was nobody to say you have to do this. The federal government had no power. So if somebody broke a federal law, then they had to ask the states to go and enforce that law. Meaning, enforce a law means, like marijuana is a federal law that you can't, use marijuana. Well, this would be like if the federal government couldn't send in, the DEA to go arrest people. If they had to say, well, we can't do anything about it, like we can't enforce the law, so states, will you please enforce it? So they can't do anything. Approval of 9 states was needed to enact the law. So you had to have 9 states to agree on any law. And that's a large majority that they needed back then. So it was difficult to even make laws. All right, the next one. Amendment to the Articles required the consent of all 13 states. If anything was going to be changed, it had to have everyone's approval. The government had no executive branch, so there's no leader who's kind of leading the country in a sense of like foreign policy decisions and multiple other things, kind of setting the tone for what the country's about and the direction that it's headed. There was no national court system. All of the courts that we have today that are federal, we didn't have any of them back then. So they didn't have a Supreme Court. They didn't have circuit courts. They didn't have anything like that. So there's no court system at all. So a lot of different things. Like we could read through, we've read through all these, so there's just a lot of problems within the federal government that they didn't, things where they should have had power, but they didn't, and it created these massive problems. Okay, so they could declare war and make peace, but again, like if you can declare war, but you can't require your states to send you troops, and you can't require your states to pay for the war, well, I mean, what does it matter? They could coin and borrow money, so that was one of the things they could do. They could deal with countries and sign treaties, but again, going back to the coining and borrowing money. So they could coin and borrow money, but, why would you borrow money if you can't pay it back? Because we had no guarantee that we could get the money to pay it back from the states, even if what we were doing was helping those states. So those are the strengths of the Articles of Confederation. But again, they're strengths, but a lot of them are unenforceable. Right, and so then they can operate post offices, which was also a strength. Right, property foreclosures led to uprisings among Massachusetts farmers called Shays' Rebellion in 1787, but the government couldn't pay for an army to stop it. So Shays' Rebellion was pretty serious. You had these farmers that, we don't need to really get into it, but you had these farmers that really thought that they thought that the government was overstepping their bounds. The Shays' Rebellion was a group of farmers who believed that now that they had gained independence from England, now the federal government of the United States of America was basically doing the exact same thing that England had done. And so they're going to rise up against our government, and we had to put down the rebellion. But we didn't we couldn't pay for an army to put down the rebellion. And that was a major problem. The federal government was so weak that it was almost near falling apart. And it was almost weak enough that it could have gotten, beat by a force that was as small as, these people in Shays' Rebellion. And that scared a lot of people in the federal government and people that cared about our independence and cared about us staying together as a nation and didn't want us to split. And so Shays' Rebellion is really one of the reasons why we end up with the Constitution. Okay, so again, poor farmers in western Massachusetts were angered over high taxes and prospects of debtor's jail. So back then, if you had a debt that you didn't pay, you could get sent to jail. Now we don't do that. If your parents owe money on something and they don't pay it, it hurts their credit report and they won't be able to borrow money anymore. But we don't throw people in jail for not paying their debts anymore. Back then they did. So Daniel Shay led an uprising and closed debt courts and threatened a federal arsenal that was there. So they eventually put it down. But this is a big deal, and this is something where we have to decide: are we going to support the federal government to put down rebellions like this? So it showed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation and led to the creation of the Constitutional Convention. So if you want to know about The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, we've already talked about those, but then what led eventually to people being scared enough to call the Constitutional Convention, it was Shays' Rebellion, and just seeing, hey, these ragtag farmers, that there wasn't even very many of them, and they almost were able to threaten an entire arsenal that could have then led to another rebellion that the federal government would not have been able to take care of. And they couldn't call troops up. They had to rely on the states to agree to everything. They didn't have money to pay for an army. And so it's a big deal. And so people that care about the country, people that want the country to stay together, they're going to call for a stronger federal government, which is how we get the Constitutional Convention. Okay, after Shays' Rebellion, people like Hamilton and Madison started calling for a stronger national government, just like I said. And in 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to discuss ways to improve the Articles. It starts as kind of they call this meeting, and hey, we're going to make the Articles better, and we get out of that. And at the end of 1787, we get the Constitution. So they basically throw out the Articles and start over. Okay, instead of revising the Articles, the delegates replaced it with a Constitution. Okay, this becomes known as the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which gives us our Constitution that we still have today, that has stood the test of time over and over and over again, and we still use today. And the Constitution that they come up with, everything our government does comes out of that Constitutional Convention, except for the Bill of Rights, which is very important as well, and which we'll be talking about in the coming weeks. All right, so I hope you guys learned a lot about the Northwest Ordinance, as well as the Articles of Confederation. When someone asks you about the Articles of Confederation, just know that it was the original form of government in the United States, and it was weak, intentionally weak, so that it wouldn't be a all-powerful government like England had been and step on people's rights. But that weakness eventually led to its downfall, and Shays' Rebellion kind of proved that it was too weak. And then if you are ever asked on a test about the Northwest Ordinance, just understand that it gave the structure for a territory becoming a state. The other thing that's very important is it outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territory, which later on, when we talk about the Civil War, obviously there's slavery in the South, but there's no slavery in the North because the Northwest Ordinance outlawed slavery in the North. So that becomes a big issue as well. All right, guys, until next time, I hope you learned a lot, and keep studying out there, and we'll see you soon.